the first thing Lyra heard was the sound of teeth tearing through food. The tiny alien pressed herself against the cold steel wall of the cargo crate, her whole body no taller than 4 inches, glowing faintly blue in the dim light of the salvage ship. The human sat only 8 feet away at a metal table bolted to the floor, broad shoulders hunched, chewing slowly while the hum of old engines vibrated through the hall. Every record her species had ever collected about humans carried the same warning: apex predators, omnivores, unpredictable. Lyra had memorized the data as a child on her homeworld, but memorizing something in a classroom was different from hiding on a human ship with nowhere to run. The smell reached her next, salty and rich, drifting through the stale air vents. The human held a strip of dark jerky between his fingers and took another bite, completely unaware that a living being smaller than his thumb was watching him in absolute terror. Lyra's tiny heart pounded like a drum. In her culture, predators always prepared their food first. They ate one thing while waiting for the next. She looked at the metal floor around her, the open room, the distance to the air vent nearly 6 inches above her head. Too far, too exposed. If the human saw her now, there would be nowhere to hide. The man leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly, tired, rubbing one hand across his face as the pale light from a cracked monitor washed over the room. His name, though Lyra did not know it yet, was Ethan Carter, a salvage engineer who had spent the last 11 hours repairing the outer hull plates of a drifting freighter. Tools lay scattered across the table beside him: a magnetic wrench, a thermal cutter, a dented metal mug half full of cold coffee. Ordinary objects to him, giant monuments to her. Lyra's hands trembled as she shifted her weight, the metal beneath her feet colder than space. She had escaped a damaged transport pod less than 20 minutes earlier, crawling through a cracked maintenance tube until she reached this cargo bay. She thought she had found safety. Instead, she had found a human. Ethan took another bite of jerky. The sound echoed like thunder to her sensitive ears. Lyra squeezed her eyes shut for a moment and whispered the only thought, repeating inside her mind: "He will see me, and when he does, he will eat me." She slowly opened her eyes again. The human stood up. His chair scraped across the floor with a long metallic groan that vibrated through the deck plates. Each of his steps was heavy, measured, crossing the room toward a supply locker barely 3 feet from where Lyra hid. To her it felt like an approaching earthquake. The massive figure stopped. Silence filled the ship except for the quiet hum of the reactor and the slow rhythm of human breathing. Lyra held her breath. Maybe he would not notice. Maybe predators only hunted what they were already looking for. Then Ethan reached for the locker door. As the metal panel swung open, a beam of bright white light spilled across the floor and directly onto the tiny blue figure frozen beside the crate. Ethan's hand paused in midair. For a long second he didn't move. His eyes narrowed slightly as he leaned closer to the floor. Lyra felt the shadow of his face fall over her like a passing moon. And in that moment, she knew the human had finally seen his next meal. Ethan Carter did not move for several seconds because his brain needed time to accept what his eyes were seeing. The small blue figure on the metal floor was no larger than 4 inches tall and glowing faintly like a living drop of moonlight against the gray steel plates. He leaned closer, resting one hand on the locker door, his shadow covering half the cargo bay while the quiet engines hummed behind the walls. Lyra froze completely, as if even breathing would betray her presence, and the massive human face above her felt as large as a planet in her vision. Every instinct in her body screamed that this was the moment predators acted, the moment the hunt ended. Ethan squinted slightly and whispered under his breath, "Okay. Either I am more tired than I thought, or that little blue thing is actually moving." Lyra understood none of the words, but she heard the sound of his voice and expected the next movement to be sudden and final. Instead, the human slowly lowered himself to one knee beside the crate, careful, deliberate, as if approaching something fragile. The metal floor vibrated under his weight, and Lyra nearly lost her balance. Ethan studied the tiny figure with wide eyes, his expression somewhere between confusion and disbelief. He had repaired broken ships, recovered lost cargo, even discovered strange organisms drifting in abandoned stations before, but nothing like this. The small creature looked back at him with enormous luminous eyes, her thin arms raised defensively, as if she believed the giant above her would strike. at any moment. Ethan quietly set the locker door closed and placed the strip of jerky back on the table behind him. The movement was slow, controlled, almost cautious. Lyra watched every motion, waiting for the trap to close, waiting for the predator to show its teeth again. Instead, the human simply sat on the floor, crossing his legs like a tired mechanic taking a break. The distance between them was still nearly 2 feet, which to Lyra felt like an endless desert of exposed metal. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck and let out a long breath. "Well, that is definitely new," he said softly. To the empty cargo bay, Lyra did not understand the meaning, but she heard something unexpected in the tone, something calm. Predators did not sound calm when they had already cornered their prey. The human leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, careful not to move too fast. His eyes remained locked on the tiny glowing figure, as if he was afraid she might vanish. Lyra slowly stepped backward until her back touched the wall of the crate behind her. There was nowhere else to go. Her heart beat so fast she could feel it in her fingertips. Ethan noticed the fear immediately because the small creature trembled like a leaf in winter air. He raised both hands slowly and opened his palms toward her in a silent gesture that even animals often understood. "Easy," he murmured, his voice barely louder than the quiet hum of the reactor. The cargo bay lights flickered softly above them, casting long shadows across the floor. Lyra stared at the open hands of the giant human and tried to understand the strange behavior unfolding before her. He had already seen her, already cornered her, and yet he had not reached out to grab her. He had not shown teeth, not made any sudden movement. He was simply watching her, as if she mattered. Seconds passed in silence. Ethan finally glanced back toward the table, where his food sat untouched, and then back to the tiny blue stranger on the floor. A faint, puzzled smile appeared on his face as a new thought crossed his mind. "You know," he said quietly, "if you are real, you are probably hungry too." Ethan Carter did not reach for the tiny creature, even though it stood less than 2 feet away from him on the metal floor. Instead, he slowly leaned back a few inches as if giving her space, his large hands resting loosely on his knees, while the quiet hum of the ship filled the cargo bay. Lyra watched every movement with intense focus because predators always revealed their intentions through motion. The human's eyes shifted briefly toward the table behind him, where the strip of jerky still rested beside a small pack of bread squares wrapped in thin plastic. He seemed to consider something for a moment before turning back toward her again. "All right," he said softly to himself, his voice calm and thoughtful. "Let us try not to scare the tiny glowing visitor." Lyra did not understand the words, but she heard the tone, and it did not match any hunting call recorded in her species archives. Slowly, carefully, Ethan extended one arm backward without breaking eye contact with the small blue figure and reached across the table until his fingers found the bread pack. Every movement was slow enough that Lyra could see it coming long before it happened. When the human finally pulled his hand back into view, he was holding a small cube of bread between 2 fingers. The piece hardly larger than a sugar cube by human standards, but to Lyra, it looked like a block of stone. Her pulse quickened because she believed she understood the ritual now. Predators often fed prey before consumption in some ecosystems, allowing the body to regain strength before harvest. She took a small step backward, pressing herself against the side of the crate as the human gently lowered his hand toward the floor. Ethan stopped about 12 inches away from her and carefully placed the bread cube onto the metal deck between them. He immediately withdrew his hand and leaned back again, creating even more distance. The gesture confused Lyra more than any threat could have. If he intended to capture her, he had already allowed the opportunity to slip away. The cargo bay remained silent except for the steady whisper of circulating air and the faint tapping of a loose cable somewhere inside the wall. Ethan watched the tiny alien for several seconds before speaking again in a low voice that carried no pressure. "Food," he said slowly, pointing toward the cube and then tapping his own chest as if explaining something simple. Lyra followed the direction of his finger and stared at the bread. The smell was warm and mild, completely different from the sharp scent of the jerky he had been eating earlier. She waited, expecting the human to suddenly lunge forward, but he remained exactly where he was, sitting cross-legged on the cold metal floor like someone waiting for a shy animal to trust him. Seconds passed. Lyra's stomach tightened with a quiet ache she had tried to ignore since escaping the damaged transport pod. The bread sat only 6 inches away from her now, close enough that she could feel a faint warmth rising from its surface. She glanced up again at the enormous human watching her carefully. His eyes held curiosity, not hunger. Slowly, with the caution of someone stepping onto thin ice, Lyra moved one small foot forward. Ethan did not move at all. She took another step, then another, until the bread cube towered over her like a pale wall. The smell made her realize just how exhausted she was. She placed both glowing hands against the soft surface and tore away the smallest possible crumb. The taste was simple, warm, unfamiliar, but safe. Across the 2-foot distance, Ethan Carter quietly exhaled in relief, as if something important had just gone right. And for the first time since she had seen the human, Lyra felt a small crack appear in the certainty that he planned to eat her. Lyra stood beside the towering cube of bread, holding the tiny crumb she had torn away with both glowing hands. And for several seconds, she simply stared at it, as if expecting the universe to correct itself. Predators did not feed prey gently. Predators did not sit 2 feet away with patient eyes and open hands. Yet the human remained exactly where he was, cross-legged on the metal floor of the cargo bay with the soft hum of the ship surrounding them like distant wind. Ethan Carter watched the little alien carefully, barely breathing, because one sudden movement might send her running again. He had spent years repairing drifting ships and broken equipment across the asteroid belt, but nothing in those years had prepared him for the moment he was now living through. The tiny blue visitor finally lifted the crumb and took another cautious bite, and the faint glow of her skin brightened slightly, as if warmth had returned to her body. Ethan could not help smiling a little at that small change. He kept his voice low and calm, speaking the way someone might speak to a frightened animal that had wandered too close to a campfire. "That is better," he said quietly, though he knew she could not understand the words. Lyra listened to the deep vibration of his voice and noticed something that confused her even more than the food itself. There was no sharp edge in his tone, no excitement of a hunter who had captured prey, only a gentle rhythm that rose and fell like slow breathing. She finished the crumb and looked up again, meeting the enormous human eyes watching her across the floor. The distance between them was still wide in her scale, nearly 24 inches of cold steel, but it no longer felt like a hunting ground. Ethan slowly reached back toward the table again, pausing halfway through the movement so she could see exactly what he was doing. Lyra stiffened for a moment, but did not run this time. He picked up the plastic bread pack and carefully removed another cube, this one slightly larger than the first. The motion was deliberate and unhurried as he leaned forward and placed the second piece of bread about 6 inches closer to her than the first one had been. Then he pulled his hand back and rested his palms on the floor behind him, leaning away as if to make himself smaller. The gesture puzzled Lyra deeply because every survival instinct she possessed told her that powerful creatures did not shrink themselves for weaker ones. She approached the new piece slowly, her small feet making soft tapping sounds on the metal deck. The cargo bay lights flickered once above them and reflected off her glowing blue skin like a tiny star moving across the floor. Ethan watched her reach the bread and carefully break off another crumb, and he felt something inside his chest loosen that he had not realized was tight. For the first time since he saw her, she was not trembling quite as much. Lyra tasted the bread again and noticed that the human had turned his gaze slightly away from her now, looking toward the wall of tools instead of staring directly at her. The decision was intentional, even though she could not know that. Ethan understood enough about fear to realize that constant attention could feel like pressure. The cargo bay fell into a quiet rhythm after that, the sound of distant engines humming through the hull, while the small alien slowly ate, and the human mechanic pretended to be busy studying a dented wrench on the floor beside him. Minutes passed like that until Lyra finally lifted her eyes again and realized something that none of her species' records had prepared her for. The giant human predator had not tried to capture her, had not tried to harm her, and had even looked away so she would feel safe. And that realization was far more confusing than fear ever was. The cargo bay slowly settled into a strange and fragile peace that neither of them fully understood. The distant engines hummed through the walls of the salvage ship, while soft white lights flickered across the ceiling panels, and in the middle of the wide metal floor Ethan Carter remained seated cross-legged like a patient statue, while the tiny blue visitor continued eating small crumbs of bread beside the crate. Lyra no longer trembled the way she had when the human first discovered her, yet every movement she made was still careful, every step measured as if the calm around her might break without warning. The piece of bread beside her had slowly become smaller as she tore away crumb after crumb, and with each bite the faint glow of her skin grew slightly brighter, reflecting gently against the gray steel deck. Ethan noticed the change even though he pretended to be studying a scratched wrench on the floor beside him. He kept his gaze low and relaxed because he understood one simple thing about frightened creatures. Sometimes the kindest thing you could do was look somewhere else. Minutes passed quietly until Lyra finished the last crumb she felt safe taking from the bread cube and lifted her eyes again toward the enormous human sitting nearly 2 feet away. He had not moved closer, not once, not even when she turned her back to him while eating. The realization slowly formed in her thoughts like a sunrise breaking through clouds. Predators did not ignore easy opportunities. The archives of her people were filled with warnings about human strength and appetite, yet none of those records described this kind of patience. Ethan finally shifted slightly, stretching one leg out in front of him, while keeping his upper body relaxed and slow. The movement made the metal floor creak softly beneath his boot, and Lyra instinctively froze again, her glowing eyes wide as she watched the massive limb move. Ethan immediately stopped the motion and rested his hands on the floor beside him, lowering his shoulders to appear less threatening. "Sorry," he murmured quietly, even though he knew the small alien could not understand the word. The tone of the sound mattered more than the meaning. Lyra tilted her head slightly as she studied his face, again, noticing details she had been too frightened to observe before. The human's expression was not sharp or predatory, but tired and thoughtful, the look of someone who had spent many hours alone with machines and empty space. A faint stubble covered his jaw, and his eyes carried the distant focus of a mechanic who solved problems for a living. After a moment, Ethan slowly reached toward the table again, moving with the same careful rhythm he had used before. This time, he picked up a small metal bottle and unscrewed the lid, revealing a shallow cap filled with clear water. He placed the cap gently on the floor halfway between them, and then leaned back once more, giving the small glowing stranger the same respectful distance. Lyra watched the water with cautious curiosity, because liquid meant life to her species. Yet trust was still something fragile and new. She stepped forward 1 inch at a time until the tiny pool of water reflected her blue light like a miniature mirror. When she finally knelt beside it and dipped one small hand into the surface, the cool sensation sent a quiet wave of relief through her exhausted body. Across the cargo bay, Ethan Carter allowed himself the smallest smile, because the moment the tiny alien chose to drink from the water he offered, something invisible had quietly changed between them. Lyra remained beside the small cap of water for several quiet moments after the first sip, both hands resting on the cool metal rim, while the faint blue glow of her skin reflected across the tiny surface like ripples of light. The cargo bay around her felt less like a hunting ground now, and more like a strange shelter floating through the endless dark of space. She lifted another handful of water and drank again, slowly this time, allowing the cool liquid to settle the tight ache that had lived in her chest since the moment her damaged transport pod had broken apart in the asteroid belt. Across the floor, Ethan Carter watched without staring directly at her, his head tilted slightly downward, as if studying the old wrench beside him, even though his attention remained quietly focused on the small glowing figure only 2 feet away. He had learned long ago that trust did not appear suddenly. It grew in small, quiet pieces. The ship hummed steadily around them, and the soft vibration traveled through the deck plates beneath his boots. Lyra listened to that sound carefully because the rhythm of the vessel felt strangely calm compared to the roaring engines of the larger transport ships she remembered. When she finished drinking, she slowly stepped back from the cap and looked up again at the human. This time she did not retreat immediately. Instead, she studied him with cautious curiosity, her head tilting slightly to one side, as if measuring the enormous creature sitting across the metal floor. Ethan noticed the change instantly. The fear in her posture had softened into something different, something closer to confusion. He allowed himself to glance toward her again, keeping his movements slow and predictable so that nothing would feel sudden. "You are a tough little traveler," he said quietly, his voice steady and warm in the empty cargo bay. The words meant nothing to Lyra, but the tone carried a softness she had not expected from a species her people described as relentless hunters. She took one careful step forward, then another, the distance between them shrinking from 2 feet to 20 inches. Ethan remained completely still except for the slow rise and fall of his breathing. The bright ceiling lights reflected faintly in his eyes, and Lyra could see that those eyes were not sharp with hunger, but filled with quiet curiosity. She looked down at the tools scattered around him, enormous objects by her scale, each one shaped for work rather than for harm. The thick gloves beside the wrench, the scratched metal mug, the folded cloth used to wipe grease from machinery. Nothing about the scene looked like preparation for a hunt. Minutes earlier she had believed this giant creature would eat her without hesitation. Now she found herself standing only inches closer, trying to understand why he had instead offered food and water. Ethan slowly reached to the side and picked up the empty bread wrapper, folding it neatly before placing it back on the table behind him. The motion was casual and unthreatening, the simple habit of someone cleaning his workspace. Lyra watched the movement closely and realized something important in that moment. The human was behaving as if she belonged there, as if her presence was not an emergency or a prize, but simply another small life sharing the same quiet room. She lifted her glowing gaze again toward his face, and for the first time since their meeting her shoulders relaxed just a little. Across the cargo bay, Ethan Carter noticed that tiny change and understood that the frightened traveler who had once believed him to be a predator was beginning to see him as something else entirely. The quiet rhythm of the salvage ship continued as Lyra stood a little closer than before, her glowing blue form reflecting softly against the scratched metal floor, while Ethan Carter remained seated across from her, like a patient mountain that had decided not to move. The distance between them had slowly shortened from 2 feet to barely 18 inches, and although that change would have seemed impossible only minutes earlier, neither of them rushed the moment. Lyra studied the enormous human again, noticing details that fear had hidden before: the worn fabric of his work jacket, the small scar across one knuckle from years of repairing stubborn machines, the tired focus in his eyes that belonged to someone who spent long nights alone with tools and broken ships. Ethan shifted slightly and reached toward the side of the cargo bay, where a small handheld scanner rested on the floor beside his toolbox. The device was about the size of a flashlight and used to check the temperature of damaged engine parts. But when he lifted it, Lyra stiffened immediately, her body glowing a shade brighter as instinct warned her that the human had finally chosen a tool. Ethan saw the reaction at once and froze with the scanner halfway in the air. He lowered his shoulders and gently set the device back on the floor where it had been, then lifted both hands again in the same open gesture he had used earlier. "All right," he said quietly, his voice calm as warm air moving through a vent. "No machines yet." Lyra did not understand the words, but she clearly understood the action. The human had stopped the moment she showed fear, as if her comfort mattered more than his curiosity. The cargo bay lights flickered once above them, and the soft glow of her skin rippled across the steel like reflected water. Slowly she relaxed again, her small hands lowering from the defensive position they had risen into. Ethan waited a moment before moving at all, then carefully reached to the side and slid the scanner a few inches farther away from both of them, removing it from the center of the space. The action was deliberate, almost ceremonial, like someone clearing a table so a guest could feel welcome. Lyra watched the motion with growing confusion because the behavior did not match anything recorded in her people's archives. Humans were described as ambitious, powerful, unpredictable, yet the giant sitting before her was acting with the patience of someone protecting a fragile glass sculpture. She took another step forward without fully realizing she had decided to do it. The distance between them closed to barely 15 inches now. Ethan remained still, resting his elbows loosely on his knees, allowing the tiny traveler to approach at her own pace. The hum of the ship continued around them, steady and gentle like a heartbeat traveling through metal. Lyra looked up at his face again and noticed something new in his expression, not hunger, not ownership, but something closer to quiet responsibility. The realization unsettled her more than fear had, because it suggested that the human did not see her as food or cargo at all. He was watching her the way someone watched a lost child wandering through a storm. Ethan finally spoke again, softer than before. The words meant more for the silent room than for the small alien who could not understand them. You must have come a long way, little traveler. Lyra tilted her head at the sound of his voice, and for the first time since their meeting, she did not step backward when he spoke. Instead, she stood there in the open space between them, glowing faintly against the steel deck, beginning to realize that the giant creature she had believed would devour her might actually be the safest being she had encountered since leaving her home among the stars. Lyra stood only 15 inches from the giant human now, the faint blue light of her skin reflecting softly across the worn metal floor, while the quiet hum of the salvage ship continued around them, like distant wind moving through a canyon of steel. The space between them felt smaller than before, not because the cargo bay had changed, but because the fear inside her chest had slowly begun to loosen its grip. Ethan Carter remained seated where he was, elbows resting loosely on his knees, watching the tiny traveler with the careful patience of someone who understood that trust was built in silent moments rather than sudden actions. For a long time neither of them moved, and the ship drifted through space, with only the steady rhythm of its engines to fill the room. Then a soft electronic chime broke the calm. The sound came from the control panel mounted high on the wall behind Ethan, a quiet alert tone that meant the ship's long-range scanner had detected something approaching. Ethan glanced over his shoulder automatically and reached toward the small wrist display attached to his work sleeve. The screen flickered to life with a pale blue grid and a single blinking signal moving slowly toward the ship's position. Ethan frowned slightly, not with fear, but with the tired annoyance of someone who had hoped for a quiet evening. Lyra noticed the shift in his attention immediately. The giant human's eyes had turned away from her for the first time in several minutes, and were now focused on the glowing panel behind him. She followed his gaze and saw the faint light of the display reflecting off the metal wall. Although she could not read human instruments, the sudden change in atmosphere made the air feel different. Ethan slowly stood up, moving carefully so that the motion would not startle her, and walked the few steps to the control panel mounted nearly 5 feet above the floor. The moment he rose to his full height, Lyra felt small again, barely taller than the rim of the water cap behind her. Yet she did not run. Instead, she watched as he tapped the screen and studied the approaching signal. The scanner showed a small vessel drifting through the outer edge of the asteroid field, closing the distance at a steady pace. Ethan rubbed his chin thoughtfully as the system identified the craft as an independent salvage runner, the kind that searched abandoned ships for valuable cargo. Under normal circumstances, he would not care who passed through this quiet sector of space. But tonight the situation felt different. His eyes moved back toward the cargo bay floor where the tiny glowing alien still stood near the breadcrumbs and the cap of water. Lyra noticed the way his expression changed as he looked at her again. Something protective had appeared in his eyes. The same quiet responsibility she had sensed earlier, but stronger now. Ethan lowered the brightness of the control panel and walked back toward the center of the room, kneeling down once more so that his enormous form felt less overwhelming. The distant vessel continued drifting closer on the scanner, but the human's attention had already returned to the small traveler standing only a short distance away. "Looks like we might have company soon," he said softly to the empty air, his voice calm but thoughtful. Lyra did not understand the words, but she sensed the meaning in his tone. Something new had entered the story unfolding around them. Outside the silent hull of the ship, another vessel was slowly approaching through the dark. And for the first time since meeting the human mechanic, Lyra began to realize that the giant who had given her food and water might soon have to decide whether to protect her from the rest of the universe. The soft alert from the control panel faded into the background hum of the ship, but the meaning of it remained inside the quiet cargo bay like a distant storm moving slowly closer. Lyra stood in the open space between the scattered tools and the small cap of water, her faint blue glow steady as she watched the human kneel down again across from her. Ethan Carter rested one hand on the metal floor while the other loosely held the edge of the nearby crate, his eyes thoughtful as he looked at the tiny traveler who had appeared in his ship only a short time earlier. Outside the thick hull, the silent darkness of the asteroid belt stretched for miles in every direction, and somewhere within that darkness another salvage vessel was drifting steadily closer. Ethan knew how those ships operated because he had once flown routes just like them, searching abandoned wrecks for anything valuable enough to sell. Sometimes that meant broken engines, sometimes it meant rare minerals, and sometimes it meant unusual life forms that collectors would pay fortunes to study. His gaze shifted briefly toward the control panel glowing on the wall before returning to Lyra again. The small alien had moved slightly closer without realizing it, and now stood less than a foot from his knee, looking up at him with wide, luminous eyes that reflected the pale cargo lights above. The fear that once dominated her posture had softened into uncertainty, and that uncertainty carried a fragile trust that had not existed before. Ethan slowly reached toward the table beside him and picked up the small metal cap that had held water earlier, turning it gently in his fingers before placing it down again closer to her side of the floor. The movement was calm and familiar now, another quiet gesture that said she was welcome to stay where she felt safe. Lyra watched the action carefully and then looked up again as if trying to understand the reason behind it. Far above them, the scanner emitted another soft tone, a reminder that the approaching vessel had moved several miles closer through the asteroid field. Ethan exhaled slowly and leaned back slightly, studying the glowing figure before him, as if weighing a decision that did not require words. Finally, he spoke in the same gentle voice that had carried through the room since the moment he discovered her. "Looks like the universe might get crowded soon," he murmured softly, his eyes warm, despite the tired lines around them. Lyra did not understand the language, but she recognized the shift in his expression, a quiet determination forming there. The human was not looking at her the way a hunter studied prey or the way a trader examined cargo. He was looking at her the way someone looked at a small, fragile life they had already decided to protect. Outside the ship, the distant salvage vessel continued its slow approach through the drifting asteroids, unaware that inside this quiet cargo bay a simple decision had already been made. Ethan Carter had not known the tiny blue traveler for more than a handful of minutes. Yet as he sat there on the metal floor watching her glowing form in the dim light, he understood something that required no translation at all. Sometimes the most powerful thing a human could do in a vast and indifferent galaxy was simply choose kindness. And for the first time since leaving her home among the stars, Lyra looked at the giant human in front of her and realized that the creature she once feared might devour her had instead become the safest place she could possibly stand.